Julian. Hello, everyone. I'm Mary Fitzgerald. I'm the editor-in-chief of Open Democracy. Welcome to our weekly live discussions. We have a fantastic panel ready for you today. Open Democracy, as many of you know, is a global media platform. We exist to challenge power and inspire change. Thanks to everyone joining us. We would love this conversation to involve as many of you as possible. So anyone who submitted questions ahead of time, thank you. If you want to submit comments or questions in the chat, please do so. If you're joining us from Facebook, those will be fed back to me as well. Please forgive any technical hitches, interruptions from pets or children or anything of that nature. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our panel today. We have Dawn Butler, who's Labour MP for Brent Central, a member of the House of Commons Committee on Science and Technology. We have Peter Geoghegan, who's investigations editor here at Open Democracy and author of the scintillating Democracy for Sale, Dark Money and Dirty Politics, available from all good independent bookshops. We have Jolyon Maugham, who's barrister and founder of the Good Law Project. And we have Peter Smith, who's a procurement expert and author of another excellent book available from all good bookshops, Bad Buying, How Organizations Waste Billions Through Failures, Frauds and Fuck-Ups. So without further ado, we're going to kick off. Now, I think we'll start with Peter Geoghegan, who, Peter, about an hour ago, you published a piece about how a PR firm that had been charged with handling the communications about the A-level results, which some might say didn't go exactly according to plan, was then handed award more cash to deal with the PR fiasco in the wake of that disaster. This firm got the contract without any competition and just happens to be run by some very, very close friends and associates of Dominic Cummings and of Michael Gove. That's the latest in a string of stories and scandals, really, we've uncovered about how taxpayer money has been used during COVID and how there has seemed to be very little transparency or accountability. Can you say a bit more about this, the problem we've seen emerging over the last 6 months?
Yes, well, the story you're referring to is a company called Public First, which is run by two people who are very, very close to Dominic Cummings and Michael Gove, including one of them has Rachel Wolfe, who is a co-author of the 2019 Conservative Manifesto, and James Frayne has been a long-term colleague of both Cummings and Gove, stretching back 20 years. And in many ways, this is a perfect example of it. This is a company that did no work for central government before the pandemic started. Then early on, the pandemic was given £840,000 to run focus groups that were about Brexit as well as COVID without any contracting under kind of emergency legislation, actually, which was backdated. So basically all the rules were just ripped up and chucked out the window. So you could give out, which allowed them to give out contracts to what are effectively political allies. And through the summer then, this same company has received a series of contracts. And today we were able to reveal that they were working on the kind of quite disastrous communications around the A-levels. They were brought in without contract to help the exams regulator, Ofqual, to try and deal with this chaos around the A-levels results, which I'm sure lots of people can remember, when an algorithm was used to adjudicate students' results, and so a lot of students ended up missing out of university. And actually, Public First had actually been involved in a communication strategy for communicating the algorithm-led results before that. So they were both involved in the communication that failed and then trying to mop up on it. And that's very much kind of par for the course with what we've seen with some of this contracting. And I became interested in this actually when I noticed that Deloitte, the consultancy, had been brought in to coordinate public PPE, personal protective equipment procurement from the Cabinet Office near the start of the pandemic in kind of late March. And again, these contracts weren't published. And I think there was a very reasonable question where people, which I and others were asking, and people were saying to me it wasn't working, which is why did you bring in a management consultancy to do this, and why wasn't there any contracts published? And what we've seen over the last 6 months is that this has been a kind of recurring thing. It's, you know, when the company has not delivered or questions have been asked about what they've done, they've just been given more and more contracts. And I think that's the thing that has led a lot of people to want to ask this. And I think people could understand if a company was even I think a lot of people are sympathetic to the kind of situation we've had over the last 6 months, especially in the early days of the pandemic, where you say, look, it's understandable. Government needs to react fast. You can see why normal rules wouldn't apply. And that would make sense, I think, especially now if you were saying, well, actually, if these companies have done a good job, we can see they've done a good job. We will review this in time and we will change the system. But it's a little bit like, you're kind of buying a car from someone and the car breaking down and then deciding without even trying to fix the car, you're going to go and buy 10 more cars from them. Just keep going. Why not? Because it doesn't really matter whether it works or not. And I think that's what we've seen, whether it's from kind of Serco, which have been given all these huge contracts around track and trace, which they've then outsourced to, we reckon, about 30 companies, but it's not published. And what we're seeing is a kind of revolving door as well between government and a lot of these companies that are getting contracts. So it's not just the likes of Public First. Lots of other companies that have received government contracts have really close links to government, have people who used to work in government with them, or have quite close links in the Conservative Party. So it's not surprising lots of people are asking questions, because this is huge amounts of money. The kind of contract values we're talking about with Public First are quite small, but some of these contracts are worth hundreds of millions of pounds. So it's a huge amount of money being given out with almost no oversight. And it feels as if 6 months in, very few lessons are being learned.
Thank you. I think the shorthand for this type of work we're doing at Open Democracy has become the COVID-19 gold rush, right? Well, people are sick and people are dying across the country, and infection rates surge once again. We're seeing a handful of people and companies, many of them with close links to government and allies or donors to government, getting rich and getting rich without providing the services we need. And I think there's a really interesting point here about semantics, right? We have done so many stories about Serco. They're part of the critical system, which is known as NHS track and trace, right? The title NHS track and trace would make you think that the NHS is doing this work, right? The NHS is running it, the NHS is handling it, the NHS is delivering on it. And in fact, that's not the case. It's large unaccountable firms like Serco who are doing a lot of the work. That means that when things go wrong or things go badly, any reasonable listener would assume that it was the NHS who was screwing up. And these faceless and less well-known companies are not accountable, and very often the terms of their contracts involve them being allowed to rewrite their own service agreements. The contracts that have been published have the most extraordinary terms attached to them, which you just couldn't imagine in any other context. So, Peter, I wanted to ask you, Peter Smith, how's the system supposed to work? And what's the difference between that and the way it's working now?
Okay, I'll try and keep it to no more than 5 minutes, absolute maximum. I was a procurement director in government at the end of the John Major regime and beginning of New Labour. And I've done a lot of consulting work since, done a lot of work with National Audit Office, actually. So start very quickly, the principles of public procurement are we're trying to be open, fair and transparent for obvious reasons that will get more obvious as we go through it. So they underpin everything we're supposed to do in public procurement. So we generally start by writing a specification. So what is it we want to buy? And there have been some issues around that in terms of PPE, for instance, we might come back to. And then in the spirit of openness and transparency, we advertise. We go out and we ask the market, we say, who would like to supply PPE or this consulting work or whatever it is we're buying? And people respond and say, yes, I think we'd like to do that. At which point we check them out. And we check them for 4 things. Capacity, can they actually do the work in terms of do they have a big enough factory to make the PPE? Capability, do they know what the hell they're doing in the context of what we want? Financial standing, which means can they finance it? Do they have a bit of backing behind them? And something I can't quite think of the word for, but basically, are they a bunch of crooks or not? So we check their directors for things like criminal convictions, tax evasion, that sort of thing. And all European governments have got stronger on that in the last few years. So we rule out some of those people. We're left with a bunch of people who we think can do the work and would like to do it. And we then use competition. And competition is a wonderful thing. So we ask them questions, we ask them for pricing, we evaluate that in different ways, and we work out who we want to give the contracts to. And competition has 2 incredibly powerful results. One is the sort of fairness and transparency, because it enables us to answer the question, why did we give that contract to Serco? Why did we give that contract to Peter Smith Consulting Limited? And it also helps to set what we hope is a fair price for the taxpayer and for the supplier, hopefully. Because if you were buying a car, if you go to 6 different garages and you get prices from them, you probably know that the best price you get is a fair price. And you might want to go back and negotiate a bit, but you probably know you haven't been ripped off because you've had 6 prices to compare. So that's what we try and do with public procurement. And if we have 6 bidders or 10 bidders, and we can compare the pricing they're offering and the service they're offering and perhaps other criteria, social value these days even, we can make a fair and rational decision about who to give the work to. And then we put a really good contract in place that protects the public sector, that is fair to both parties, that gives us transparency on things like who they're going to subcontract work to. I mean, I talked to the other Peter the other day about the Serco thing, and I find it absolutely incredible. If Serco truly don't have to disclose who their subcontractors are to the Department of Health, I find that just amazing and disgraceful. So they're the sort of things that we put in the contract. So looking at what's happened through COVID, obviously an awful lot of the contracts we're talking about haven't been advertised. The normal rules about capacity, capability, have you done this sort of work before, sort of went out the window in many cases, on PPE, for instance. We didn't have competition, so therefore we've got all these questions about how suppliers were chosen, and also all these questions about whether we've paid a fair price, because we didn't have that competitive mechanism. And we seem to have ended up with contracts that half the suppliers have written them themselves, which doesn't happen in perfect buying world. I can assure you of that. So that's probably enough. But there's a sort of, what it should be and a bit of what we've seen happening.
Thank you, Peter. There have been a couple of questions actually that I might ask you now about the National Audit Office. So there's someone asking about the NAO's report this week on the procurement of ventilators, what you would have done differently there, and also like more broadly, when you have these unusual, well, not unusual, but opaque arrangements with private companies, can the NAO do its job effectively? And given that there hasn't been investment in local service provision in the way they needed to and should have been over many years, can it actually do what it's supposed to do as well?
Yeah, I mean, to a large extent, yes. NAO finds it quite difficult to criticise policy decisions. But where they're dealing with facts, I mean, they are auditors. They go in and they audit. So I think we will find out a lot about what's been going on. There are a lot of facts in the ventilator report, actually, where the 2 weaknesses, I think, for NAO, and they do a great job generally. I am a fan. It's all after the event. So think of some of the reports they've done in the past on things like the NHS IT programme or fire control, which wasted £500 million, absolutely nothing. They can tear into it, but it's all after the event.
There's no consequence, really.
And there's limited consequence. The people who did it have all gone, whether they're politicians or civil servants. And we're really bad, I think, as a country, as a political community and civil service at learning from mistakes. So everybody nods and says, yes, we must never allow this to happen again. And then it does. So I think the ventilator report, I've only had a quick look. I think it's quite balanced. There's a couple of things where I think NAO could have been a little bit perhaps tougher, but it was unprecedented times and the market was going crazy and all the rest of it. I thought Meg Hillier's comment, I was a bit surprised at that because she said it was something like, this is a benchmark for procurement through the pandemic. And I thought, well, at the end of the day, there was a lot of millions of pounds, perhaps not spent in quite the right way, buying ventilators. I don't think it was that good. I don't think it was disastrous, but I'm not sure if that was a benchmark for great procurement, then I'm slightly worried about what else might come out.
Well, indeed, and I think your point about, yes, you can have blistering reports after the fact, but, the stable is open and the horse is bolted, right? There's that question of accountability, Dawn. I wanted to come to you. I mean, as a Member of Parliament for Brent Central, sitting on the Commons Committee for Science and Technology, when you hear this stuff, and you've been super engaged with all of this for months, you've been asking questions, what does it make you, how does it make you feel? And what do you think we can and should be doing?
I feel like sometimes I'm pulling my hair out because I'm like, this is a national scandal, but it's not being treated as such. And actually, it's a lot of the independent journalists and organisations who are actually doing a lot of work kind of exposing all of the discrepancies and what should happen in regards to government. And I think like Byline Times, obviously the Good Law Project is obviously doing their work, and Joe will talk about that, and Huffington Post have done amazing work in just not even teasing out, but just saying, what on earth is going on? And sitting on the Science and Technology Committee, I had the opportunity to question Matt Hancock about some of these contracts. And, you know, both Peters have mentioned some of the companies that I mentioned to Matt Hancock. And you could see by his body language that he was offended that I even had the audacity to ask him, you know, how are they procuring these contracts? Who's responsible? What are we buying? And have we received what we've bought, right? And he was unable to answer any of those questions. So in some of the questions in relation to PPE, we don't even know how many masks were ordered. So we don't know how many we delivered or if they're fulfilling their contract. In regards to Serco, they're charging the taxpayer for voided results. So that means whether they test people or not, the taxpayer is still being charged. I don't know how much they're being charged. I asked Dido how much we were being charged, if it was true. I'm still waiting for the response and answer to that. And I'm just astounding. And, you know, I'll nip in the bud now the argument that we have to do things quickly. And this is why I voted against the renewal of the Coronavirus Act this week, because we've had 6 months, right? Haste has resulted in waste. It hasn't resulted in good outcomes or, you know, we've got there in the end. The test and track system still isn't working. So haste is not the way to move forward. And part of the Science and Technology Committee was all about how are we going to learn the lessons in the last 6 months. Now, if you're refusing to even publish the contracts that you're contracted to do as a government within 30 days, I was like, then how are we going to know what you've done? If you're refusing to even accept that you've made mistakes, but instead trying to accuse me of attacking civil servants, then how are you going to learn from those mistakes? If Serco hadn't met any of their targets that have been set, but still get another contract, how is that good value for money, or how are you going to learn from mistakes? So for me, I'm pretty like dumbfounded in terms of how we are allowing this to happen. And I'm so glad that, that we're Open Democracy is having this, panel today, because I really honestly believe that the more people who hear what's going on, the more people will be outraged by it. I truly believe that.
And why do you think the secrecy? I mean, we can all assume nefarious motives, but what's the reason for secrecy? So I've seen political leaders in other countries be quite upfront and transparent about what they know and what they don't know and what they're trying and what's working and what isn't and what they've learned. And I feel like again and again, there's just this defensive and often, vitriolic attitude towards anyone who asks questions. Journalists are being framed as unpatriotic for doing our job, which is holding government to account. Our lobby correspondent, Jim Cusick, has been shut out from asking questions at Downing Street, even though he holds a lobby pass, right? Anyone who publishes anything embarrassing or asks probing questions, Guardian, Daily Mirror, is categorized as campaigning organizations like Open Democracy, which does journalism. And so there's a real us and them mentality, and an enemy and sort of mentality going on. What do you think is going on here?
Well, Mary, I think history is littered with dictators who have kind of run various countries and organizations who, as soon as there's any form of dissent, they say that you are a traitor, for daring to question. I mean, it is quite evident and obvious that Boris Johnson's advisor sees Parliament as an irritant. Do you know what I mean? They are eroding our democracy bit by bit. Parliament has no oversight in regards to what the government is doing. And look, Matt Hancock looks surprised at the best of times, right? But, genuinely, there has been times when he's just learning about what's going on in his department. You know, you can see it. You're like, oh, you've only just heard that, haven't you? You just heard about that. So, you know, there's obviously just a couple of people making decisions. And why? Why do they not want people to question? Look, in part of my letter, which I think I wrote a letter to Boris Johnson, I had said, and some people may see this as controversial, but let me put it another way. I think if anybody is somebody that gambles, you know, not excessively, I'm not promoting gambling in any way, shape or form, please read the small print, but if anybody likes to put the odd bet, I would say put a bet on these companies that have been given these procurement contracts that haven't gone out to tender, that we don't know much of the detail about. Put money on those companies donating to the Conservative Party next time there's a general election.
Well, indeed, and we've seen a number of those issues already. Peter Geoghegan and colleagues looked, for example, at the amount that property developers have given the Conservative Party in the last year, less than the last year. It's £11 million. That's more than they've ever given as an interest group ever before. Lo and behold, we have sweeping reforms to planning laws on white paper, which is something that Tory backbenchers are against and something that people across Parliament and across the country are against. So we have seen time and again special interest groups donating large sums of money and policies which appear to benefit them coming down the line pretty quickly afterwards. Yes, go ahead, Dawn.
I was going to say, but I think and that, you know, I'll be honest, that happens, of course it happens, but I think the difference here is there's public money going into companies. So there's public money being given to companies that are not delivering a good service. And that, I think, is the big difference right now. And I think the pandemic is being used as a cover. And on top of the pandemic, we're going to have Brexit. So, you know, I do think this is being used as a cover.
Indeed, Peter Geoghegan, you've actually looked at some of those instances, haven't you, where people or companies that have given specific amounts of money to the Conservative Party and then have landed contracts. Could you give us a few examples of that?
Well, it's something we've seen across the piece. And I think it's like, partly it's companies that have political donations, like quite small companies, a company Global Shetland. I noticed recently that Byline Times had done a story on that was interesting, and they've been a Conservative donor and they got a big contract. But I think there's almost like, you know, there's also, so that's part of it. But what you've also seen is like this kind of, like almost like a kind of an absence of any critical thinking beyond just let's do the same thing we always do. So for example, Deloitte is a very good example of this. So you've got, you know, Deloitte, I don't think are on record of giving money to Conservative Party, but lots of people who are senior Conservative Party figures have worked for Deloitte. So Chloe Smith is the Cabinet Office Minister, had worked for Deloitte beforehand. Deloitte were brought into Cabinet Office to do huge amounts of work to start the PPE crisis, the pandemic crisis, having been brought in to do almost everything all the time anyway. You know, basically, you know, you talk to people who are in this kind of industry, and let's say that Deloitte basically have, you know, passes, senior Deloitte figures will have passes to the Cabinet Office. And there's a kind of almost a mentality that just says we need to go and have management consultants to deal with everything. It was quite striking to see this story in The Guardian this week that Lord Agnew, who, you know, who's a Cabinet Office Minister, was excoriating this kind of tendency for civil servants to be bypassed and everything to be outsourced to management consultants. We did a story where we found out that at least £56 million had in COVID management fees alone had gone to these kind of consultants. And it feels as if it's this kind of mix of these companies that are very, very close to political parties, very close to political figures, and this revolving door between government and this consultancy world that I think it's, you know, it begs a real question, like, are you rewarding success or failure here? Because it doesn't seem to actually matter what kind of job a lot of these companies are doing. You know, it doesn't feel like the next contract is based on the success of the previous one. Like, for example, it looks like Serco we're going to get yet another track and trace contract, despite having, you know, despite an abysmal record. You know, I've spoken to people who've been, well, they're not working, they're working for Serco, but they're outsourced. I've spoken to people who've been outsourced, they work for travel agents. They've been outsourced to deliver contact tracing, which again, you can kind of go, okay, if this was working, we might be able to see some rationale for it, but the record is really abysmal. So time and again, we've seen these companies that are close to government get these kind of contracts and fail to deliver. And it is, I think it's a scandal that this is not, you know, you would think that by this stage you would have stopped doing this, but it's almost like a daily occurrence. The story we did today is just, it feels like almost kind of a daily story that you're doing yet another story about government contracts going out without procurement to people who are politically connected and don't have any track record of success.
I mean, to your point about failure, it's interesting talking to people outside of Britain and explaining what's going on, because it's just embarrassing and it's tragic. I mean, we have the highest COVID death rate in all of Europe, right? That is not something that that anyone should be proud of in government. And it's extraordinary to me that this sort of British exceptionalism myth still pervades, where we do things the way we decide to do them, and anyone who asks questions about how it's done is unpatriotic, and of course everything's right and proper, which is sort of the attitude. And then you know, we had this sort of invocation of the Blitz spirit early on, and all these other patriotic nationalistic tropes to paper over the fact that this has been an abject disaster. It's been not even a second-rate performance, like a bottom-rate performance. And it's affecting people's lives, it's killing people. Test and trace is all about stopping people from catching a deadly virus and giving it to other people. So it could, you know, yeah, I will stop there and I will ask Joe. We've talked a lot about the problems and about the frustration and about the way the system is not working the way it should. You're trying to do something about that. Can you tell us what you're trying to do and what the potential legal avenues there might be towards accountability?
I mean, I don't think it's any exaggeration to describe it as a scandal. Way back in June, I was chatting to a very nice guy, bit of a wide boy, who was talking to me on the phone from his front room, and he was talking to me about the 747s he had chartered to fly PPE over from China. And, you know, a couple of months previously, he'd been a website designer, and he had no knowledge at all, as he freely admitted, of PPE. And I said to him, in a nice way, I said, are your friends surprised that you're chartering 747s? And he was like, yep. And are you making a lot of money? Well, you know, we're making sort of a 10 or 20% margin on most of these contracts. So we're making an awful lot of money. And I keep in touch with him, and he's very forthcoming. And he tells me about the jaunts that he's taking around Europe, staying in the best hotels and flying first class with all of this money that he never in his life imagined that he would come to have. I mean, that's our money. I mean, I don't blame him. As I said to him on that call, if government's handing out free cash, right, who's going to blame you for joining the queue? But that's very much how it feels to lots of people. Government was handing out free cash and they joined the queue and they got their share. And it does make all of us who haven't had our share wonder a little what we need to do to get it. I mean, beyond that, there are some really quite striking stories from a very sober lawyer I was talking to the other day, who told me that her client had been asked for a bribe, had been told you will get a multi-100 million pound contract from government if you pay a percentage of the profits on that contract to a particular special advisor. Now, I can't evidence that beyond reporting that this was said to me by a solicitor who was as shocked to find themselves telling it to me as I was shocked to hear it. I mean, it's striking stuff. So in terms of what Good Law Project is doing, we're sort of pursuing fundamentally 4 different types of judicial review, and I think at the moment we've got 7 judicial reviews in this sphere afoot. So we're pursuing a couple of cases around the letting of contracts to your mates, and that's Public First and Hanbury. We're pursuing 3 judicial reviews specifically in relation to bizarre choices of counterparty for letting PPE contracts, and that's Ianda and Clandeboy and Pestfix. We've got one systemic challenge because the law is really, really, really clear, unconditional. You have to publish details of contract awards within 30 days. And in relation to contracts that are awarded without a tender, they are taking much, much longer. In relation to contracts awarded following a tender, they're complying with their legal obligations. But for direct awards, as you call them in the trade, they're taking a lot longer. So we have that systemic challenge. And, you know, in a way, the thing that's winding me up most at the moment is this moonshot stuff. Because as it seems to me, I mean, you've got this £100 billion plus, like a staggeringly large number. It's like almost £2,000 for every man, woman and child in the country. This staggering project that most scientists don't think will work, that government admits is founded on technology that doesn't yet exist, that is justified by a profoundly movable narrative. So originally government was talking about the need for universality of testing, and the leaked documents refer to testing being mandated, right? So someone's going to strap you down on a gurney and shove a cotton bud up your snoz. But in fact, now government is talking about charging for those tests that we collectively are going to spend £100 billion on developing. And that's, if you stop to think about that for a second, it's really quite a profound change in the narrative. And the thing that's bugging me about moonshot is no one knows who made the decision. And I, you know, in my heart of hearts, and I talk to people all the time about this stuff, I think basically Cummings has decided he wants to do this. Can't prove it. It's just my gut instinct. And everyone has learned that if Dominic Cummings wants to do something, it is not in your long-term career interest to get in his way. I mean, you know, Sajid Javid proved that, didn't he, when he got sacked, in effect, when he was felt compelled to resign as Chancellor of the Exchequer for disagreeing with the blind driver. And I just don't really like the idea of one unelected official getting to tie the millstone of £100 billion of extra debt around the necks of my children without there being some, I'm not ambitious these days, some kind of modest level of scrutiny, which we're not getting. The question, he said after that lengthy preamble that Mary actually asked me was, well, what difference is all of this stuff going to make? And there are probably three different types of implications. So there are legal implications. So a court may declare that these contract awards were unlawful. It's possible it will even unwind some of these contracts, although that is not hugely likely. But a declaration of illegality is something that will be profoundly embarrassing to the government. There are also criminal law implications. So obviously, if we were able to show that the award of these contracts was corrupt, that would be criminal. But those couple of cases that I put into my sort of contracting with your mates basket, government isn't really defending them. Government hasn't said in response to our judicial reviews, no, we acted lawfully in doing this. Government has just said, you can't challenge us. You haven't got, as lawyers say, standing to challenge us. It's not saying they were lawful. And the reason I think that they're not saying that these contract awards were lawful is because if they assert that they are lawful, they will then have a duty to show us the process pursuant to which those contracts were awarded. And that process might well show us that, in fact, it's not just a coincidence that two of the firms with whom the Cabinet Office contracts, Public First and Hanbury, are long-time associates of Cummings and Gove. And if Cummings or Gove had contracted with pals, that would be actual bias and could be misconduct in public office, which is a criminal offence. And so I think government is concerned not to jump out of the warm frying pan into a very hot fire, and so they're not going to defend those cases. So my expectation is we're going to win them. And then there are real political implications to all of this too. So I saw a couple of questions pop up in the chat box about what FOI law means these days, and questions about what select committees can ask, and indeed what MPs, diligent, hardworking MPs like Dawn Butler can do to try and bring transparency to this. And the answer is not really that much. If you have a government that has largely ceased to care, then they can keep open democracy journalists out of press conferences. In fact, they can avoid answering MPs' questions. They can snub, refuse to turn up at select committees. But, you know, legal proceedings have a slightly sharper edge. Ultimately, the judge can order you to do something. And if you don't do it, you can go to prison. So, you know, in a sense, what Good Law Project's doing is a kind of journalism, really. I mean, we've made quite a lot of noise taking these PPE cases. And it's just worth stopping to think, actually, none of those cases have yet got to the permission stage. So none of them have yet even passed the first hurdle of judicial review proceedings. It's not that we've not been given permission, it's just that the courts are quite slow and haven't yet got round to considering whether or not we ought to have permission. And yet we've been able to have quite an impact. And that is because there are legal consequences attached to not responding to legal actions. And so there is a sense in which what we're doing is journalism. Just one point before I hand over, before I stop. It's not really party political, this stuff. So earlier this afternoon, I spoke to a prominent Conservative MP. I've spoken to other Conservative MPs. They are concerned about this narrative, and they are concerned about good governance. So I do think it's having an impact. I rather agree with Dawn on that front.
Yeah, and likewise, I've spoken to at least one Conservative MP that sees this as a bit of a scandal, and I think many more are seeing this as well. But a few things. First of all, just very quickly, what's the expected time frame for the judicial reviews? One person asked.
So we were told we would hear about permission in the second half of September. And then it turned out, when we asked politely a couple of days ago, you don't want to ask in a rude way because then they don't like you very much, that in fact the papers have got mislaid somehow. We are expecting a decision on permission pretty quickly. We've got hearing dates in February, I think.
So dog ate my homework for some delay, and then February is probably the next the hearing date. And someone else asked, and I think Peter Geoghegan, I might come back to you here. Someone said, perhaps I'm exceptionally naive here, but can we not appeal to the freedom of information? And given the conversation we were just having earlier today, could you paint the picture of where freedom of information is right now?
Yeah, it's not in a great place, actually. Yeah, so like obviously freedom of information, this idea like anybody, it's not just journalists, anyone can request information that a public body holds. So you can go and send an email or a letter or anything, you can phone them up and say, or tweet them, can I get this information? So that sounds great. But actually in practice, what we've seen across the board is, you know, FOI, freedom of information, really kind of running into the sand. It takes years literally at times to get information out. At Open Democracy, we've ended up in the courts a number of times to get what would, I think, seem like quite basic information. You know, we end up in the courts to get the research that the European Research Group had produced that was paid for by public money. You know, that we have to go to the court to get that. We often have to end up in court to try and get information. And what's happening with a lot of this sort of stuff is the government is relying on two things. It's saying it's going to publish these things eventually. So we don't have to give you the information now because we're going to publish it eventually. So there's, you know, tough luck, even though you spent months asking them for it. But also commercial sensitivity is a new favourite as well. So there's commercially sensitive information here. We couldn't possibly give it out, despite the fact, well, it begs the question, well, it's public money that you're using. So where's the commercial sensitivity in that? Surely there's of much greater public interest in telling the public how the money was spent, rather than the commercial interest of the company that's actually getting the public money. So unfortunately, FOI, when it comes to a lot of this sort of stuff, is a very blunt tool. Like, we're doing a lot of work with FOI. We've got a report coming out into the state of FOI. We are, you know, trying desperately. People like Dawn, you might be hearing from us about this, because it is something I think is super important. But at the moment, like a lot of other stuff, like the kind of stuff we're talking about when it comes to transparency and governance, it's just not working.
Yeah, so others were asking, you know, but how can they get away with not publishing the contracts after 30 days if that's what's required of them? The answer is just, they're just not doing it. And they're saying, oh, coronavirus pandemic, it's an emergency. I mean, that's the unofficial story again and again. And there are no mechanisms really to hold them accountable. Joe makes a good point about, I mean, there's a reason why you're starting to hear about activist lawyers in a derogatory sense, okay? It's because, you know, if our government won't turn up to select committees, if they won't answer questions of journalists, you know, ultimately they can be held accountable in courts, but, you know, that takes a long time and it's expensive and it's complicated, and, you know, the law has limited amount of uses and applications. So, you know, that is the situation. They are simply, when it comes to FOI, when it comes to procurement, when it comes to all kinds of other things, they're just ignoring it and using the pandemic as a pretext. And, you know, Open Democracy has been looking at the ways in which democracy and human rights and civic freedoms have been rolled back across the world under the pretext of COVID. At one point during the pandemic, 2 billion people were living under suspended or indefinitely suspended parliaments. And it's just a great excuse for autocratic rulers and you know, leaders who don't want to be accountable to the people who elected them. Dawn, I wanted to come back to you and ask you about this because, you know, obviously with the majority that the Tories hold, what opportunities or paths for challenge are there in Parliament and in politics? And yeah, where do you see this going?
It really is a depressing situation, to be honest. You know, with a government that has an 80-seat majority and you know, it's just the Prime Minister and, you know, his special advisor that's making all the decisions, and Parliament doesn't have any oversight or any scrutiny powers. And it is very frustrating because actually, you know, we talk about British democracy and us being the mother of all parliaments and having the oldest democracy in the world, and it's something that we hold dear and proud, and that, you know, Parliament is sovereign, and, you know, but, you know, we need to, it feels to me like a real battle to get our democracy back and try and somehow hold the government to account. I mean, even the way that parliamentarians vote at the moment is the way to subvert democracy. You know, it's ridiculous the way they've got us queuing and hemmed in and, you know, to vote. So the main areas of scrutiny really are select committees, and even that, you know, yes, you can't. Ministers are supposed to attend. I mean, back in the day, I think if ministers didn't attend, they would be locked up in the tower. You know, but you know, things have kind of moved on a little bit since then. So, but they are supposed to attend select committees, and at the moment, that is really the only way to kind of hold government to account. Because if you listen to debate, so we had this 90-minute debate on extending the Coronavirus Act for the next 6 months, which, you know, we could go into, but we could have had a longer time to debate, but they didn't. And so what the speaker actually said, and he actually stood up to the minister this week and basically said, you know what, because you are holding Parliament in contempt, I'm going to now allow more urgent questions into Parliament. And so now we will have other opportunities to put urgent questions down, which will force the Minister to come to Parliament and explain what they're doing and why. But it's still, unfortunately, to be honest, it doesn't stop them from doing what they're doing, because we've got no legislative framework of stopping them. And that's the problem.
Thank you. And I was reflecting on your initial comments there about the way that we see ourselves in British democracy, which is actually often really, frankly, patronising and has been for a very long time, but is just stuck in sharp relief. One person who's written in the comments said, "I'm an Italian, I live in London. How many times in Italy and Italians have been mocked by the Prime Minister and other UK public figures?" Italy, despite being first hit by COVID, is far behind in terms of current figures. The story that UK is a freedom-loving country is far too weak to justify the evidence that management of this government was and still is catastrophic. And I think that I've seen that a lot, as a journalist looking at the media coverage since the beginning of this crisis. There was this somber coverage of, coffins being lifted into the ground with forklifts in New York, and these poor benighted Italians in Spanish with their field hospitals. That was all happening to poor benighted foreigners elsewhere, and the coverage, certainly in the conservative-leaning press, was about our fighting spirit and everything, and it's just turned out to be a hopeless, incompetent mess. But I wanted to zoom the lens out a bit, because again, to you, Peter Geoghegan, the problems of money and accountability in politics, they didn't just surface during the pandemic, right? There's some longer stuff going on here that I'd love to hear a bit about more from you. You've written a book about it.
Yeah, no, I think this plays in. This is unfortunately, this is exactly what kind of you could see happening. Whether it's FOI, when I'm talking about FOI, that's a long-running saga, or just the role of money and influence in buying political access in Britain. When I finished my book in June or January of this year, and I remember thinking, oh God, I wonder, your partner's going, am I being too unfair on British democracy? I'm writing about how money and lobbying and influence and misinformation has been warping our democracy. It's allowed small numbers of people to have unrivaled access to politics, but also it's changed and shifted our democracy in ways that I think we all are struggling to really keep track of and understand. 6 months later, when my book came out in August this year, I realized I'd actually been too kind. It was worse than I could have imagined. The levels of cronyism and the levels of capture almost is just, I think it's really, really damaging and dangerous. And I think you're now seeing, we can all really accept it now. We can use words like cronyism in a way that I think a lot of people who wouldn't have used those words 6 months ago are using them now, because it's really, what else can you use to describe this? When someone just for one example, what happened with Public Health England. So Public Health England was a product of a series of pretty botched reforms from a few years ago from a previous Conservative-led government. Then I did a lot of work on my book about the use of anonymously funded think tanks and how they kind of can warp the political process. So I keep track of these people, so I read all their newsletters and stuff like that. When the pandemic struck from kind of April on, the likes of the Institute of Economic Affairs and Taxpayers Alliance were talking about how it's all Public Health England's fault. The whole problem is Public Health England's fault. An already kind of creaking organisation. So then Matt Hancock decides we're going to get rid of Public Health England, a decision that was announced at Policy Exchange, which is a think tank funded by anonymous donors, and we're going to replace it with NHS Track and Trace, headed by Dido Harding, who is a Conservative appointment to the House of Lords and is married to a Tory MP, and has no accountability. So the problem with Public Health England, there's a huge accountability gap with Public Health England. There's lots of problems with Public Health England, but that to be the policy outcome, it mind boggles.
So Peter Smith, I'm going to put you on the spot here, which is, if we were to build a mass campaign, like a mass mobilization around one thing that we, could demand, in Parliament, on the streets, and the pages of Open Democracy, somehow shoehorn it to one of Joe's judicial review processes. What's the one thing that you think could be done? And of course, it's complicated, and the straight answer is the government needs to follow the rules and have better oversight and accountability. But is there one thing that would sort of translate into the public fora that people could get behind, do you think? You know so much about this subject. Is there one intervention that would be really critical?
In the procurement space, I mean, obviously, given what's gone on, I think it's the transparency of process, because, you know, for all we know, the people buying PPE have done a great job, but they haven't told us anything about what they've been doing, and the issues that have been talked about with FOI and the lack of teeth there. So, you know, just transparency about, tell us how Ianda Capital and PestFix were chosen and how you arrived at that price. So, you know, I mean, I could talk about competition and so on as well, but it is that openness, because if we knew that, we might be reassured. I mean, I was shocked with Jolyon's comments about literally bribery, because I've always felt that, with a few exceptions, UK public procurement had far too much nepotism and who you know, and the thing we talked about with people going off to work for other companies. I mean, that happens in MOD to a terrible extent. You know, the guy who's buying fighter planes the next month is working for the company making them, which doesn't make him a very good negotiator when he's negotiating on behalf of the taxpayer. But I would have said there wasn't a lot of actual brown paper envelopes changing hands. So, you know, I'm shocked by that, and I hope it well, who knows. But the transparency, how are you deciding on those firms? Okay, you couldn't advertise and give people 2 months to respond to it, but you must have had a process. Tell us what your process was for deciding who to give those PPE contracts to. And that's a relatively simple message, but whether enough of the public are interested, I do despair sometimes.
Yeah, well, I mean, on a positive note, I mean, you know, we earlier this year, again, to your transparency point, we noticed that the NHS data store, which is basically a massive, ambitious project to process our personal data to try and help with the COVID response. The NHS COVID data store project, which involved a large number of, large tech firms, Amazon, Google, and creepy firms like Palantir, which is owned by a Trump-backing billionaire, were involved in this NHS COVID data store project, and there was no transparency around the terms of a deal. And we asked questions, we FOI'd, we were pushed back. We teamed up with some awesome lawyers at Foxglove, and we wrote them a pre-action letter, and we threatened to sue. So we threatened to judicial review the decision. And the very, very last minute, hours before we were to issue court proceedings, they released 160 pages worth of documents. And that was really encouraging. We should never have had to do that. And we were prepared to sue them. But it does indicate that pressure sometimes can and does work. And we got 13,000 people behind us signing a petition. We've got widespread media coverage. There are ways you can bang the drum to force disclosure and force accountability. Of course, we then mined through the 160 pages of documents, and lo and behold, many of the things they told us about the protections that they put in place turned out not to be true. The claims that the firms couldn't profit out of the intellectual property generated turned out to not be true. The framing of this as a short-term COVID response turned out not to be true. There's often some pretty nefarious reasons behind the secrecy. But I guess to leave this on a mildly encouraging note, that coordinated pressure through different channels, legal, public, media, policymaker, etc., can work. So I don't think all is lost. And watch the space on all those NHS data deals as well, because there's probably a lot more coming on that front. Just in terms of final remarks, does anyone else have anything they want to offer, any of the rest of the panel, on critical interventions that could be made now by I mean, lots of people in the chat have asked, what can we do? What can we do as citizens? And I would say, you know, support public interest journalism, engage with your MPs, you know, all the typical things. But any of the rest of you reflecting on this conversation, if you want to just put your hand up and give me a couple of sentences. Yes, go ahead, Joe.
So one of the real difficulties we have is that people are frightened. And in particular, economic operators, by which I mean those who might supply some of these services, are frightened. If you are an economic operator, by which I mean somebody who might have wanted to have bid for this contract, one of these contracts, even a small political consultancy, public affairs firm, you can make complaints to the Commission the EU Commission, and complaining of sweetheart deals, in effect, being offered to your competition. And then the Commission will pick up those complaints and run with them. And they'll probably, at the moment, in all honesty, run with them with some degree of enthusiasm. So that's something that you can do if you are or know people in that space. It will have an impact, and you don't need money and you don't need to be a lawyer.
Thank you. And there are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people across the country working in these systems we have just described, right? And are seeing shocking, terrible things every day, ways in which power is being abused, services are not being delivered, things are being swept under the carpet. If you are any of those people, there are secure channels through which you can come and tell us what you've been seeing or hearing. And again, just to use the example we just did, you know, some of the journalism we do can lead to tangible and concrete change. We always respect the anonymity of sources, and we take security around this stuff very, very seriously. So if you know, if you have seen or heard or experienced or in possession of documents that show something happening that shouldn't be happening, or where obligations are not being lived to, taxpayer money is not being spent well, services are failing, critical services are failing, please get in touch and let us know. And yeah, that's another thing I would always say. Watch this space as well. We are looking to challenge the government. Well, indeed, the government is trying to challenge us. We have an interesting tribunal coming up around freedom of information. So while Peter expressed deep, intense frustration with the way the freedom of information system is working right now, the Information Commissioner has ruled in our favour, and the government is trying to challenge that ruling. So there'll be more ways that we Open Democracy are challenging secrecy through the court. So do sign up to our newsletter and follow us on social media if you'd like to know more about that in the months ahead. And if someone in the chat said, if anyone has offered you an envelope full of cash, please let Mary know.
Can I quickly say, Mary, just, you know, if people can, I think they should donate to all the public interest journalism and all the work that you guys do, because, you know, that's where I think change is going to happen in the future. So, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, we're not getting any lucrative COVID contracts, and we're working very. Do you not provide PPE? Do you not? You're not a pest company.
Surely.
We've got some hand sanitizer in the office, and there are some face masks.
Many of them are not supplying PPE either, to be fair, and yet they're still getting PPE.
We'll put the link to the donate into Open Democracy's donate button in the chat. But yeah, we're not getting rich out of this COVID-19 gold rush. We're working hard, and we are working on limited resources. So any contributions, I'm very grateful to you, Dawn, for raising that. Thank you. And thank you to all the panelists. This has been a fantastic discussion. And please watch this space and follow all of the panelists in their excellent work, and more power to all of you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.